This was the harsh reality for millions of enslaved individuals in the southern United States, a reality that not only shaped their lives, but also the very fabric of the American economy. The role of slavery in the southern U.S. economy was monumental, serving as the backbone of the region's prosperity and setting the stage for a conflict that would tear the country apart. The Southern economy's reliance on slavery was not a matter of mere convenience, but a crucial component of its agricultural dominance. Cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, crops that demanded intensive labor, were the lifeblood of the South and the engine of its economic growth. These crops were not just commodities, they were symbols of wealth and power, cultivated through the sweat and blood of enslaved Africans brought to the American shores in chains. The southern states produced as much as 75% of the world's supply of cotton, earning it the nickname King Cotton. This wasn't just an agricultural triumph, it was an economic strategy built on the backs of the enslaved. The profitability of these crops, particularly cotton, fueled a vicious cycle of demand for slave labor. As cotton became more profitable, due in part to the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, plantations expanded, and so did the demand for enslaved workers. This demand perpetuated the domestic slave trade, tearing families apart and subjecting millions to a life of bondage purely for economic gain. Consider the human cost of these economic decisions. Children separated from parents, spouses split apart, and individuals stripped of their humanity, all for the cultivation of a crop. The economic benefits of slavery were not limited to the agricultural sector. The wealth generated by slavery bolstered the entire Southern economy, financing infrastructure projects, banks, and international trade. The ports of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans thrived, bustling with activity as ships carried cotton, tobacco, and sugar to markets around the globe. These economic activities transformed southern cities into commercial hubs, directly tying the prosperity of urban centers to the exploitation of enslaved laborers. However, the economic advantages brought by slavery to the South had a dark underside. It created a stark class divide within the Southern society, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few plantation elites while leaving many white Southerners impoverished, unable to compete with the labor costs of slave-based agriculture. This inequality sowed seeds of discontent, creating societal rifts that persist to this day. The moral and economic contradictions of slavery eventually led to its undoing. The growing abolitionist movement in the North, fueled by the stark portrayals of slavery's brutality, such as those in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought the issue to the forefront of national consciousness. The moral crusade against slavery clashed with the economic interests of the South, culminating in the Civil War, a violent reckoning over the future of slavery and America's soul. The legacy of slavery's role in the Southern economy is a testament to the enduring scars it has left on American society. The wealth amassed through centuries of exploitation helped build institutions and fortunes that persist today. Yet, the cost was immeasurable, a cost borne by those who lived in chains and those whose lives were shattered by the loss of loved ones to the slave trade. The deep socioeconomic divisions that slavery created between the North and South, the rich and the poor, blacks and whites, have rippled through generations. Slavery's role in the Southern U.S. economy is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a cautionary tale of how economic systems can justify the dehumanization of individuals for profit. It is a stark reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, a challenge to confront the legacies of our past to build a more equitable future. As we reflect on this dark period of American history, let us not forget the lives that were forever altered by an economy that valued cotton more than human dignity. Their stories, their suffering, and their resistance must not be forgotten, for in them, we find the strength to fight against injustice wherever we see it today.
White bridges to wealth and power. The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful. Since the beginning of time, Africa has been generally recognized as the richest continent on earth. It was blessed by both God and nature. with a riches of soil, natural resources, and human spirit. Biblical and secular records proclaim Africa as the birthplace of all mankind. As admonished, mankind was fruitful and multiplied, leaving Africa with additional historical and cultural riches. With so much riches and heritage, one must wonder why Africa remained the most poorly developed continent with poorly developed countries on earth, and why generations of blacks around the world are so totally impoverished and powerless. If blacks are to change their marginal conditions, they must know the secret to other racial and ethnic groups, wealth and power. Blacks need to know what devices Europeans use to acquire and establish control of wealth, especially since a few centuries ago, Europe was an impoverished continent. Moreover, if blacks are to achieve self-empowerment, they must be able to see the parallel between Europe and the United States. They must know not only the socio-economic development of Europe, but also what specific facilitators stifled the development of Africa. Modern day black impoverishment and powerlessness began neither in the urban ghettos nor in rural cotton fields of America, nor were they elements of West African culture. These racial conditions began in the interior of West Africa and can be directly linked to the geopolitical practices of European whites and Arabs centuries ago. Historical records clearly evidence that European wealth was extracted from Africa and the Americas using black labor as the primary instrument. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to precisely pinpoint when European whites began to exploit Africa and blacks, because it appears to have started by chance, then escalated into an international practice founded on a racial ideology of broad sense of a white community. Religious, ethnic, and natural differences within the broad Christian family became subordinate to the collective economic exploitation of blacks during the Middle Ages. The economic exploitation of Africa and blacks began in the minds of Europeans and Arabs who placed good and profit above the value of human life. Their collective ground and mechanisms have left blacks a legacy of suffering and a black holocaust that is yet to end. The beginning of the great wealth displacement. If a marked displacement of Africa's wealth into European treasures is any indicator, then it can be speculated that the major extractive period began during the 14th and 15th centuries. During this time, the entire European continent was riddled with poverty, famine, feudalism, and disease. The entire continent was in an economic depression, especially Western Europe. Europe's economy was also weakened by the steady loss of precious metals in Asian nations who would accept only gold payment for trade purchases. While Europe was enduring stagnating socioeconomic depressions, West Africa was known for its flourishing empires, major regional trading centers, and for producing some of the world's finest artifacts. Nations throughout the Mediterranean area were drawn to the West African trading centers by rumors of massive wealth. The large empires Ghana, Mali, and Sangha drew European, Moorish, and Arabian traders into West Africa's great trading cities such as Gao and Timbuktu. Arabian and Moorish traders routinely sought West African cash crops and natural resources, especially gold, silver, ivory, and salt. Arab traders' interest in West Africa was more than routine trade. Their aggressiveness reflected their interest in controlling and profiting from the wealth of West Africa. Though they controlled most African seaports, especially along the length of the Red Sea, Arabs felt threatened by inland black unity and empire building. The Arabs sought greater access to African wealth through intermarriage, concubinage, trade, and religious proselytizing missions, advocating one religious brotherhood. The Arabs fabricated a trading language, Swahili, to facilitate trade. I'm gonna say that again. Arabs facilitated a trading language. Arabs fabricated, that's what he said. Arabs fabricated a trading language, Swahili, Swahili to facilitate trade. Often they exerted religious pressures and continuously fostered holy wars that weakened the great West African empires. Arabs labeled Black African pagans, then pressured them to disavow their own West African culture and practice of ancestral worship, and to accept instead Arabic culture based on Islamic religion. This cultural and religious conversion undermined Blacks' African heritage and broad sense of Black community. Moreover, the religious conversion to the Islamic faith gave Arabs nearly unrestricted access to West African societies and wealth. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Dr. Claude Anderson's amazing book, Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. Today we're reading Chapter 6, White Bridges to Wealth and Power. And Chapter 6 is a pretty long chapter. So for this video, we're reading from pages 107 to 128. Once again, that's pages 107 to 128 in Chapter 6, White Bridges to Wealth and Power. And in this chapter, we're basically diving into how white nations, all white nations, not just European white nations, but white nations throughout the world, how they were able to extract resources from the African continent to build their wealth. And those resources, natural resources, were either resources from like the minerals, the riches of the minerals and the things out of the ground, those resources, or even human resources, right? The African continent, as we learned when we read Destruction of Black Civilization, the African continent was basically stripped bare of so many resources for so many thousands of years. And we're not just talking about modern times, because we got to go back to prehistoric times as well, when the human resources were continuously taken from the African continent. And also with this, where it's landing is those resources, those Black resources, African resources, were used to enrich white nations, whether it was Arab nations, whether it was South American nations, whether it was the United States, whether it was Europe, whether it was Australia, all throughout the world where white people existed, where white people resided, they used Black labor to enrich themselves. And that labor that they use, not only just stripping the minerals and the resources out of the ground, but extracting the Black labor that enriched them and left the Black nations poor, impoverished, and created a wealth gap. And there's a maldistribution of wealth throughout the world when it comes to Blacks and whites. And anybody who classifies themselves as white, right? Due to this extraction of the resources. And that's what we're getting into in this chapter. That's why they're saying white bridges. What is this? White bridges to wealth and power. How was the white wealth built? Because it wasn't just built just off of their hard work and determination. Like Dr. Anderson stated when I was reading earlier, just a few centuries ago, Europe was barren, impoverished, filled with disease, feudalism, all types of problems. But then they discovered that they can use the wealth they can use the labor of the Africans to extract the wealth, not only out of the African continent, but out of the Americas and the Caribbeans and throughout the world, and use that to enrich themselves and build up their empires. Because we know when Isabella and Ferdinand united and they expelled the Moors, and after that kicked off the transatlantic slave trade, and here we are. So we're going to get into a lot of that today, of this building of the wealth. But it explains why we are where we are today in America as Black people throughout the world, in America, no matter where we are. It explains economically and socially why we are where we are. We were extracted from the African continent to be a labor class, a working class, to enrich others. And we have to understand that point. We were not extracted to become friends. We were extracted to enrich others. And we were conditioned to think that that was our destiny. So let's jump back into the reading. Page 110, the first chapter, Religion and Color Unite Racial Exploiters. Religion and color unite racial exploiters. Listen to that. Religion and color unite racial exploiters. The removing of wealth from Africa was not completely confined to Arab and Moorish traders. And that we need to understand. Africa was stripped blind by all of its enemies, not just the Europeans. They were later joined by traders from Portugal and Spain, who established trading posts around the coast of West Africa, an area commonly known as the Ivory Coast. These groups built their trade around the naval strength and rarely traveled to inland markets. In 1444, listen to the date. In 1444, the first Africans were kidnapped and taken to Lisbon, Portugal, for the specific purpose of enslavement. Contrary to many reports, the first Africans kidnapped and taken to Portugal were not West African Blacks. They were Berbers and Arabic-speaking light-skinned people who practiced the Muslim religion and belonged to the Caucasoid race. The Portuguese returned the Berbers to their desert homes after they had extensively questioned them about Black West Africa's alleged wealth. This incident probably represented the first steps in developing a plan to capture and trade slaves and establish slavery as an international business rather than a trading custom. Since color was the decisive factor for slavery, it was important to know who was and was not a member of the Black race. Moors were not classified as members of the Black race. Moors were not classified as members of the Black race. In Northwest Africa, the offsprings of Blacks were Berbers, and Arabs became known as Moors. They lived along the Mediterranean Sea, north of the Sahara Desert. Few identified with West African Blacks and lived south of the Sahara. However, the few Moors who were Black, with the aid of some Islamic converts, pushed the doors to West Africa's natural and human capital wide open. They helped the exploitation come in because they were accepted, because they looked like the people. The Arab and Moor merchants were the few traders who could safely venture into the interior trading markets. Most traders dared not to leave the coastal port cities. Norman Coombs, in his book, The Black Experience, expressed the belief that though many Mediterranean and European nations were more advanced than West Africa in military weaponry, science, and technology, the formidableness of Africa's interior and the reputed fighting skills of the Black warriors dissuaded the more militarist nations from attempting to take West Africa's wealth by force. Instead, they chose to gain access through trade activities. So they didn't want to go into an area that they were unfamiliar with and have a war with the Africans just right off like that. They needed more information, more intel, more secret ways to get in to get the advantage. it's not smart to go into something and not have the advantage. So the Europeans make sure they put themselves in a position to have the advantage over the Africans. So when they attacked, they could attack and win. By the late 16th century, West Africa had lost its reputation of invincibility. Her great empires had been weakened by divisive internal forces, which diminished the sense of West African nationhood or togetherness and left its natural and human capital resources unprotected. Tragically, West African leaders failed to take protective measures to guard their natural and human resources from the wealth-seeking self-interest of foreign traders, right? So now we're going to get into the impact that black on black enslavement had, right? When Africans decided to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. Black West African sense of community was narrowly and decisively based on tribal origins rather than the commonality of black skin and the color of collective racial destiny, right? I'm gonna read that again so we can understand that. Black West Africans' sense of community was narrowly and divisively based on tribal origins rather than on the commonality of black skin color and collective racial destiny. Tribal and extended family commitments rarely extended beyond the village compound. West African societies that practiced tribalism had a narrow group identity, much racial detachment, and intergroup animosities. The practice of black on black enslavement made them vulnerable to united ethnocentric groups who were seeking wealth and power at any cost. Weakened from within, West Africa had little basis for developing a broad community capable of uniting against a common enemy because of the concept and the code and the way they lived. The tribalism provided the wedge the Arab traders eventually used to divide and conquer nearly every trade in West and Central Africa. African tribal chiefs ignored the greediness of foreign traders who sought increased access to African wealth. Divided and preoccupied with old tribal differences, many West African societies saw little wrong in enslaving and selling blacks from other tribes into slavery. Having escaped Portuguese slavery based upon their lighter skin color, the Berbers joined the Arabs and became the first modern people to create a continuing commercial demand for a large number of black slaves. Historian David Bryan Davis indicated in his book, Slavery and Human Progress, that Arabs enslaved and exported into the Middle East at least 1 million black slaves every 100 years from 800 AD to modern times. This practice continues at unknown levels today, right? So basically the mass enslavement, what Dr. Anderson is getting at, what Chancellor Williams got at, is the initial mass enslavement and extraction of black people from the African continent started with the Arab slave trade, which has been the longest slave trade to happen to the African continent and is still active, right? So understanding that when we're talking about the wealth of Africa and the resources of Africa being taken away, it's not just from the European lens, but it's from the lens of all enemies, all outsiders, all invaders, especially all who could be considered white, whether they're European or Caucasian. Remember, the Europeans come from Europe and the Caucasians come from the east in the Caucasus Mountains, right? So it's talking about our rationale for black on black slavery, right? West African tribal chiefs had a long history of exchanging slaves with Arab traders. Eventually, they explained the practice to European traders. An important trading custom of tribal chiefs was to insist that all foreign traders purchase some of the chief's personal slaves in order to demonstrate an act of good faith and bargaining. Other historians such as Norman Coombs, August Meyer, and Elliot Rudwick possessed that tribal chiefs could have included this slave purchasing ritual in their trading practices for the purposes of impressing Arab and more traders with their toughness as well as the absolute control over their subjects as resources. If this in fact was their motive, Then they succeeded. The Arab and European traders became convinced that if tribal chiefs could purchase slaves, the trade would be profitable, and they had no reason to expect reprisal from any black nations. A massive slave trading operation developed, and according to an article in the Washington Post, the Arabs were still engaged in the slave trading of blacks in 1993. And from my understanding, it's still happening today in 2025. Still happening today in 2025. So because we're all familiar with the European transatlantic slave trade, but we need to understand what the Arab slave trade did to weaken the African continent and make it a lot more vulnerable for the transatlantic slave trade. So the doctrine of unequal exchange. While Africa's human capital was being displaced through slavery, so too was its natural and mineral wealth. Arab, Moor, Spanish, and Portuguese merchants traded low-value fabricated items such as pig iron, brass rings, religious artifacts, household gadgets, and used firearms for Africa's highly valued commodities such as gold, silver, quality leather, long cotton, art objects, black slaves, and ivory. European manufactured items were primarily for decorative processes or tribal warfare. African commodities, on the other hand, were internationally used to undergird major economics and currencies. This imbalance described by Thomas Sowell, a black economist. I laughed. It's Thomas Sowell, a black economist, as the doctrine of unequal exchange allowed natural and mineral wealth to be transferred from Africa as a steady flow. So he might got something right there, right? So natural and mineral resources were traded for bull crap. Basically, that's what they're getting at. The value of the natural and the mineral resources vastly outshadow and outcast the value of what they were traded for with the European trinkets and stuff. They outweigh, they outshadow, they overlook. This is vastly more valuable than what the Europeans gave them for that, right? So the Europeans got things that will continue to build them wealth, and the Africans got stuff that had no value after they gained possession of it. Massive displacement of Africa's human capital and natural resources weakened West Africa's social and economic institutions. The doctrine of unequal exchange developed Africa's resources, but the wealth and revenue generated from commerce with Africa's revived Europe's sagging economies. With surplus funds and their treasures, European nations strengthened their military and commerce communities. Right? By the 17th century, European nations had formed a competitive sense of racial togetherness with the European family. In addition, they shared a common desire to possess more, if not all, of Africa's wealth. As a result, Europeans established trading routes and outposts along the coast of West and South Africa. Foreign traders boldly ventured into the interior in search of natural resources and human black gold. Exploiting tribalism to divide and conquer, traders supplied the chiefs with weaponry and other compensation for killing and enslaving other Africans. The traders succeeded in gaining control of much of the African continent. So the Europeans put their differences aside and said, you know what? We're going to take our time, strengthen ourselves, unite ourselves, collect ourselves. And when we do that, we're going to go for gold. And they did. That's why they rule the world at this point. That's why they are the dominant racial group in the world, right? The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful. That's the quote at the beginning of the chapter. The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful. We have to understand our enemies. We have to. It was no mere coincidence that in the latter part of the 15th century, Europe began recovering from centuries of poverty, while Africa was increasingly exploited of its mineral wealth and human capital. as millions of Africans were being kidnapped and sold into slavery around the world. Slavery became a simple mechanism by which the wealth of Africa and blacks could be transferred to Europe. Displacement of African wealth was so massive during the 15th and 16th centuries that socioeconomic and political upheaval resulted. Northwestern European nations won the competition against Southern European nations to determine which would become the major slave trading region. Southern European banks were the first to feel the effects of the influx of new European wealth. Banking and commerce activity in Western Europe caused a leading and investing resolution that resulted in the relocation of the international banking center from the Mediterranean area to Western Europe. The old mercantile economic principles eventually evolved into the basic economic principles of modern capitalism and political doctrines. With their newly acquired wealth, the major goal of European nations was to accumulate large amounts of gold and other precious metals. Most European nations needed to replenish their depleted gold reserves. Further, Europeans wanted access to raw materials, especially gold and silver, because of their unusual value and rarity. The amount of gold and silver owned by developing European nations was a measure of their newfound prosperity. The new mercantile merchants fostered and promoted a new capitalistic principle. In order for one person to gain wealth, another must lose wealth. That's how they operate. Slavery represented a valuable means by which one might be enriched at the expense of others. Western Europeans entered slave trading in the 16th century and applied the new capitalistic principles of old trading practices. Achieving maximum return on investment became the rule. Under Roman laws, slaves had certain rights, but under English laws, slaves were treated as property with no rights. Black slaves were reduced to a level of chattel equal to property or any other tool. To achieve maximum return on their investments, black slaves were to be worked to death during their prime years in order to recapture the investment as early as possible, because old black slaves had no value. In 1664, an English Puritan reportedly called slave trading the worst kind of thievery in the world. I'm gonna just let that marinate for a little quick second. Let it marinate. Through the centuries, Europeans espoused ethnocentric doctrines that encouraged a total and complete exploitation of Africa's natural resources and human capital. By the late 1800s, massive and concerted exploitation had taken its toll. The wealth power gap between European nations and African nations had widened so much that European nations were no longer fearful of Africa and felt they could invade and exploit at their will. In 1885, European nations met at a conference in Berlin and, without notifying any African nations, drew lines on their map to divide the African continent among themselves. Shortly thereafter, European nations established colonies throughout Africa. They colonized 90% of the African continent and controlled nearly 100% of its wealth. Only Liberia, an American colony, and Ethiopia were uncolonized at the time. In the mid-1960s, some Black African nations were restored to independence, not because white European nations had developed a moral conscience or no longer needed to exploit Africa and its people. Instead, European nations freed the African nations because they had acquired most of their wealth and power and now felt that they could control those nations just as effectively from the outside. And we see that leading up to today. That's why Ibrahim Traore, and I'm gonna keep saying his name, that's why Ibrahim Traore is a problem for the European nations. So natural resources, wealth, and Europeans acquired from Africa whetted their appetite for the finer things in life. They was like, we want some more of that African stuff, right? Most European nations wanted gold and silver because these metals were needed for coins, but moreover, they represented a mark of new wealth. These precious metals were more useful than land because they could buy anything anywhere. Thoughts of gold, jewels, and spices from foreign lands stimulated investments and trade as merchant and gentry classes pressed their governments to secure new markets. Competing monarchies in Spain, French, Portugal, and England were willing to gamble lives and newfound wealth on finding more precious metals and spices in new worlds. Adventurers such as old stank ass Christopher Columbus accepted the challenges from his financial bankers and made several fortune hunting trips to the New World. On his second trip, Columbus promised the Spanish crown in return for financial help, he would bring them as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they asked. 17 ships and hundreds of men were provided for a second voyage to the New World. To further encourage his success, the crown promised Columbus 100% of the profits and governorship over any new lands and fame. Columbus and his military contingency arrived in the Caribbean islands and made inquiries about the location of gold. After only a few pieces of gold were found, Columbus expanded his search to all of the islands, traveling as far as Haiti. He used his military advantage to conscript the peaceful, unarmed Arawak Indians into a massive gold search. And I'm just say the Taino because from what I learned, the term Arawak was the term given to them by the Europeans, so they prefer Taino. But I'm just saying that because my technical TED kicked in. As the search became futile, angry Europeans took out their frustrations on the defenseless Indians. Many were killed and mutilated. Other Tainos were driven to commit self-deletion. Within 2 years, nearly half of the 250,000 Tainos in Haiti were dead. By the year 1515, there were only 50,000 Tainos. By 1550, by 1515, there were only 50,000. By 1550, only 500 remained. Howard Zinn said that a report in 1650 showed that none of the original Taino or their descendants were left. Some argue that. Failing to find a significant amount of gold, Columbus attempted to at least keep his promise to the crown regarding slaves. He selected 500 of the strongest male and female Indians and shipped them back to Europe for servitude. But nearly all of them died en route or shortly thereafter due to climate and temperature differences between the Caribbean homeland and the European continent. Now, like the elusive Bahamian gold, an entire race of Taino Indians did not exist. So this next part is the Americas became an extension of Africa, right? So following Columbus's explorations to the New World, a new sense of European nationalism developed. European nations competitively explored South and Central America and the Caribbean islands in search of gold and other precious metals. When these resources were discovered, small contingencies of European whites colonized the areas in hopes of producing wealth in the name of their motherland. But European whites were allegedly physically incapable of doing the laborer's work, and the Indians had been killed off. As a result, black slaves became the chosen tools for producing wealth in the Caribbean and throughout the Americas. We talked about this before. Black slaves were needed in the plantation fields of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of the Piedmont, and the mines of South America. It was the massive influx and dominance of black slaves in mining and agricultural production that directly linked black enslavement to Europe's increased wealth, power, and industrialization. Organized religions joined hands with governments in the race to capture wealth in the new worlds. They merged, searching for lost souls and lost gold. In the early 1500s, high officials in the Catholic Church designated African blacks as the primary instrument of mining wealth for whites in South and Central America because Indians were being killed off by the rigorous labor and European diseases. Blacks were perceived as being physically more durable and expendable. Portuguese and Spanish slave traders moved into high sugar buying, selling, and shutting black slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. More than 90% of Africa's kidnapped blacks were shipped to South America and the Caribbean islands. Between 1600 and 1800, Black slaves outnumbered the white Europeans, entering the Americas. Up until 1820, blacks outnumbered Europeans transported across the Atlantic by a ratio of 3-1. Most were settled in Brazil, giving the largest black population outside of the African continent. These black slaves and their descendants were Brazil's dominant population until the great mass of European white immigrants arrived in the 1880s, long after slavery had been terminated and European wealth and power had been assumed. These new white immigrants arrived to reap the fruits created by forced black labor. A century later, the descendants of Brazil's black slaves were still excluded from enjoying the fruits and are so impoverished that death squads murder the hordes of black street children who scavenge for food. So that unpaid labor, that forced labor, it gave Europe what they needed. It made Europe what it was. Black people made Europe what it was. Black people made the United States what it was. The Portuguese and Spanish colonization of the Americas represented the first systematic and concerted practice by European nations to use African blacks as the main instrument for accruing wealth. From the 1500s to the 1800s, the long-distance trade policies and practices were based on profits from Africa and her dark peoples. The high profits caused black enslavement to be known as the Golden Harvest. The economics of South and Central America and the Caribbean islands were based on products made by Africans. Black labor spawned numerous cottage industries that provided Europeans with the constant flow of sugar, tobacco, molasses, vinegar, rum, precious metals. These products significantly changed Europe's customer appetites and demands. Black slaves produced a phenomenal amount of wealth for slave traders, settlers, and European nations. In the South American and West Indian markets, slaves drew an average sale price of $500 in the 17th and 18th centuries. When this figure is multiplied by the 10 to 15 million black slaves that historian Howard Zinn estimated were transported to the Americas, the revenue from the one-time only sales would amount to more than $1 trillion by today's standards. African slaves were typically sold at least twice before reaching their final destination. As a matter of practice, most of the black slaves brought into the Caribbean markets typically were seasoned, then resold into slave markets in South, Central, and North America at much higher prices and profits. So the wealth is there. The wealth is there for the Europeans, extracted from the Africans. So that wealth gap that we keep talking about, the wealth gap will never be closed by trying to do what black people are doing today. And I don't think it's our job to try to close that wealth gap. I think it's our job to become something powerful, period, and not try to worry about competing with the Europeans in that sense of closing the wealth gap, but becoming competitive overall and not making whatever Europeans have as our mark, but creating a destination that's best for us and works for us and is good for us. Stop worrying about what white folk doing. England's new wealth and power gave rise to a sense of ethnic identity and nationalism among the settlers. The nationalism evolved from a real or imagined new cultural unity, a strong sense of we against them. The thems were other nations that England sought to subjugate, namely Indians and Africans. The we's were fellow Englishmen, the colonized, the thems across the globe. To protect the we's, England strengthened its maritime control over long-distance Atlantic trading routes. It enacted the Navigation Act of 1685, which in effect declared a form of economic warfare on other European nations by reporting that goods imported from any European nation or any English colony be shipped only on British vessels. The act also prohibited the colonies from either developing manufacturing industries or purchasing processed goods from any nation other than those under the control of the British Crown. In addition, the Navigation Act gave England the power to establish a monopoly on both the slave trade and the marketing of slave-producing products within the colonies. The English government's control of the colonial trade virtually guaranteed English industries a monopoly over raw materials and cash crops. This rendered the American settlers entirely dependent upon England to provide them with raw materials, consumer products, slaves, and military protection. England's monopoly so restricted and taxed the colonists that they grew belligerent and eventually became thems rather than we's and revolted in order to win their independence. Right, that comes to 1775, America becoming America, winning its independence against the British. So land ownership was second only to slave labor as a resource of white wealth and power in America. Without the approval of the Indians, the London Company and officially chartered immigration agency sought to lure immigrants to America by substituting land grants of 100 acres to each colonial settler in lieu of the potential gold dividends. Other English chartering companies and colonial assemblies followed suit by offering land grants to newly arrived European immigrants. The practice of awarding land to the head of each established household was effectively used to entice European immigrants to America. These land awards represented windfall wealth that ensured economic opportunity and provided them with the basic tools for earning a living. It also generated a sense of togetherness among European immigrants in a new land. The typical colonial family only needed 2 acres of land per capita to produce sufficient food to survive, said Stanley Lebergott in his book, The Americans and Economic Record. Lebergott further stated that the greed of the European immigrants changed the use of Indian land from limited substance to widespread cash crops farmings, from religious inspiration to land speculation from capital gains. The land grants to assist colonial settlers served as one of the earliest forms of the affirmative actions in America. So white people have always been given programs and hands up by the government. The grants gave immigrants a basic level of wealth, which they could leverage to purchase additional acreage, household, farming equipment, and bring black labor onto the land. The whites' only affirmative action program allowed 3/4 of America's colonial families to own their own farms. Land grants alone were not the only government-backed benefit given to white settlers. After all, a new nation of aristocrats and a privileged class could not be built simply on the basis of land ownership. Without an available pool of labor, land had little value. It had to be cleared and brought to production. To achieve a maximum return from the land, the white settlers needed 2 things: cash crops and goods for European local markets, as well as a well-disciplined, available, non-compensated, and permanent labor supply. The free white labor force would not satisfy the criteria because it was scarce and expensive. Few European immigrants were willing to till the soil for another when free or cheap land was available to any white who wanted to homestead. If European serfdom had taught the Pilgrims anything, it had taught them that it was essential to own one's own land and strictly avoid being bound to another's land. Shortly before the Revolutionary War, wealth had accumulated in the colonies, and the settlers were some of the richest people in the world. Less than 2% of the American immigrant population had zero negative net worth. England's tariffs and economic acts that sought to redistribute the colonies' wealth to the mother country triggered a backlash of independence. After the war, the new congressional government established its own devices for transferring wealth to preferential groups. Westward expansion added a new wealth building opportunity through the land and slave ownership. These words beat me up today. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 opened this new territory for homesteading. The government sold the land at public auctions for $1 per acre. To ensure that the land would not end up in the wrong hands, Congress in 1790 passed the first national naturalization law, which specified that America would open its doors to white immigrants only. Local governments enacted anti-mobility and anti-contracting laws that forbade blacks and other own and that forbade blacks to either own or even step foot on land in the new territory. Thus, government land policies had a double benefit for whites. It gave them an opportunity to gain land, and it laid the foundation for a permanent wealth gap between them and the blacks. So white people were given handouts and hands up to help them build the wealth that they had, right? During the early 1800s, Florida was the only part of the southeastern North America that did not belong to the United States because it belonged to Spain at the time. Though the U.S. government had made numerous offers, Spain refused to sell Florida. As Spanish territory and not a part of the United States, Florida was a natural attraction for displaced Indians and runaway slaves. Escaped slaves took refuge in Florida and established geopolitical relations with Indians. Slaves and their mulatto offsprings were often given high village positions as chiefs, interpreters, military advisors, and scouts, all of which aroused Southern white slave holders who saw this as a lure to slaves seeking freedom. White planters and slaveholders encouraged General Andrew Jackson, who was noted for grabbing Indian land for his friends and personal ownership, to use his military forces to remove from Florida the Indians and escaped slaves. General Jackson complied, publicly arguing that Florida was a sanctuary for escaped slaves and marauding Indians who presented a menace to the white society. Florida, according to Jackson, was essential to the defense of the United States. In 1814, having established his public premise for taking military troops into Spanish territory, Jackson intentionally triggered the first of the 3 Seminole Wars. Jackson also burned Indian villages, seized Spanish forts, and blew up Fort Negro on the Chattahoochee River in North Florida, killing more than 200 women and children. And I just did a video on the Battle of Fort Negro, and I put that in at the end of this video and put a link in the description. But that's one of the things that we're studying right now in our Black History School, the Battle of Fort Negro and the Seminole Wars. His military incursions into Florida created a political problem for Spain, which in 1819 agreed to give Florida to the United States in 1821. In appreciation, the grateful U.S. government appointed Jackson Florida's first governor. Jackson assumed the governorship, then reverted back to his earlier practice of making money for himself and his friends by expropriating Indian land and black labor. He advised his friends to purchase Florida land and black slaves before the prices rose. An Indian treaty was signed in 1819, and most of the Indians and free blacks were forced out of Florida. Jackson kept his promise to make free or cheap land available in Florida for cotton and sugar production. But some defiant Indians and black slaves dismissed the treaty and continued to fight for their land ownership rights for another 20 years. The Third Seminole War ended in the 1840s when Osceola, the Seminole chief, died in captivity, and John Horst, the highest-ranking black Indian leader, nearly after 50 years of battles, ceased fighting without ever having been defeated or captured. When finally concluded, the Seminole Wars had cost the U.S. government $1,500 and $20 million in military expenditures. In 1970, the U.S. Indian Claims Commissions awarded more than $12 million in land reparations to the remainder of the Florida Seminole tribe. The government also offered an apology. Notably, however, the contributions made by Black Floridian ancestors were left out of the history books, and their offspring were left out of the apology as well as the reparations. Blacks have yet to receive any monetary reparations or historical recognition for their role in bringing Florida into the Union. So this last part, right? Blacks, cotton, and the annexation of the Southwest. The United States went to war with Mexico in 1846, largely to satisfy slaveholders' interest in acquiring the fertile Texas plains for raising cotton. Mexican authorities offered a limited amount of free land to groups of white land squatters, but were not willing to sell the land to cotton planters. By the 1830s, more than 2,000 whites had moved into the Texas territory with more than 2,000 black slaves. Mexican authorities outlawed slavery, but white slaveholders evaded the law by freeing their slaves when forcing them to sign lifetime contracts as indentured servants. The Mexican government responded by seeking to block any further white immigration into the territory. The 20,000 whites already in the territory responded by declaring squatters' rights on Mexican land, then publicly declared such lands to be free and independent from Mexico. Large Mexican armies attacked the American planters at the Alamo to recover Mexico's land. After the fall of the Alamo in the late 1840s, the President of the United States declared war against Mexico to justify annexing the territory for slaveholders. Stanley Legrand, the writer, questioned President Tyler, who said, the writer quoted President Tyler, who said, "The war with Mexico gave the United States a monopoly on the cotton plant and thus secured us a power of boundless extent to the affairs of the world. The monopoly was the great and important concern. It places all other nations at our feet. An embargo on cotton exploitation during a single year produced in Europe a greater amount of suffering than a 50-year war. The U.S. won a brief war, and Texas entered the Union as a slave state. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison called the war an invasion waged solely for the despicable and horrible purpose of extending and perpetuating American slavery." Right? On January 21st, 1848, Frederick Douglass, a former slave, wrote about the war in his Rochester newspaper, the North Star. He said, "Mexico seems a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxons' love of domination and land." And that's where we stopped. That's where we're going to stop today. Setting the foundation for wealth building in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe for white people, and also wealth building for the Arabs and the Moors using black labor. Black people were exploited by all of its outsiders, all of its invaders, and even some of its own people. But most of these people sided with the outsiders and the invaders. And they used black labor, they used black minerals, they used black resources to build what they have today. And then turn around and tell us to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. What a load of crock, right? So this is what we're picking up. This is what we're learning. This is what we're reinforcing. Because a lot of us already knew this information. It's just being reinforced. So America and Europe and white wealth around the world would not be what it is today without black labor and black resources and black minerals. And they're continuing to be exploited today. Black people were taken from Africa, were stolen from Africa to be laborers to enrich the ones who stole them. Never forget that. We were only brought to these lands to be labor. When we are no longer useful to them as labor, we will see how they discard us and ignore us. So what are we going to do to build for ourselves? What the quote at the beginning of the book said: "The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful. The strength of the powerless is the knowledge of the powerful." Let's make sure we know our enemies. All right, so once again, that was page 107 to 128, pages 107 to 128. For the next video, we will be reading 129 to from 129 to 153. From 129 to 153 for the second half of this chapter. And we're starting with the Homestead Act, but he's giving historical details on how white people were giving hands out and heads up and help to build the wealth that they have. They did not just go out and pull themselves up from their bootstraps. They use other people to pull themselves up. This is the truth. Let's not hide from it. Remember, like this video, comment, subscribe, and share. And if you don't hit that like button and you don't like black people, you don't support Dr. Claude Anderson, Black Labor, White Wealth, get the book, get the book, get the book. The link is in the description for you to get your copy. Let's keep supporting this channel. Let's keep supporting this Black History School. We got some things coming up in the woodworks or in the fire that we're working on. So I don't know why I said the woodworks. I don't know. But we got some things that we're working on. Some irons in the fire, rather. And we're going to get this thing together. OnTheShoulders1.com is the website. You can see at the bottom of the screen where am I pointing? Okay, you can see where you can support me. So make sure you support me. Links in the description. I love you all. And we got a lot of good stuff coming up for On the Shoulders of Giants. This is our year. This is our year to take this thing to the next level. And I will be doing that. And I'm putting it out there. I'm putting it in the atmosphere. On the Shoulders of Giants will continue to grow. We will go to the next level. And we will achieve all of our goals that we have set for ourselves. And I appreciate all of you who are supporting us and helping us reach our goals, and not only reach our goals, but surpass our goals and do things that we've never even dreamed of. So I love you all. Helping On the Shoulders of Giants helps our future. I'm serious about our children and serious about making sure our future has a future. So I love you all. Make sure y'all catch the next video coming up. Peace. Hit that like button and subscribe and comment too. Hit them comments.